I checked my thermal cameras last Tuesday morning, but I never thought what I'd see on those recordings will make my hands shake in fear. I'd been hearing strange noises around my property for about a week. Heavy footsteps, branches snapping, weird howling that didn't sound like any coyote or bear I'd ever heard. So I set up a few thermal cameras around the perimeter of my land, thinking maybe I had some trespasser or a big predator I needed to deal with. The first image nearly made me drop my coffee mug. There was this massive figure crouched low in the trees, glowing bright yellow-orange against the cold forest backdrop. At first glance, you might think it was just a person in winter clothes, but the more I stared at it, the more wrong everything looked. The proportions were all off. The shoulders were too broad, the arms too long, and the way it was crouched, no human could hold that position comfortably. It looked like it was hunting something, or maybe watching my house. I'd been living on this 40-acre spread in the Pacific Northwest for about 3 years, and I thought I knew every animal that came through these woods. Bears, sure. The occasional mountain lion, plenty of deer, and elk. But this thing in my thermal footage was something else entirely. The heat signature showed it had to be at least 8 feet tall, even while crouched down, with muscle mass that made bodybuilders look scrawny. The property had been a steal when I bought it, which should have been my first clue. The previous owner had practically given it away, claiming he needed to move back east for family reasons. He'd seemed eager to close the deal, almost desperate to get rid of the place. When I'd asked about wildlife in the area, he'd gotten this strange look in his eyes and just said I should keep my doors locked at night. I'd thought he was being overly cautious about bears, but now I was starting to wonder if he'd known something I didn't. That's when I started paying attention to things I'd been ignoring. The broken branches I'd attributed to wind damage were all snapped at about 8 feet high. Too high for deer, too systematic for storms. There were disturbed patches of ground around my property that I'd assumed were just from the heavy rains we'd been having, but now they looked deliberate, like something big had been walking a circuit around my land, patrolling the perimeter like a guard checking his territory. My garbage cans had been getting torn apart every few days, but I'd blamed raccoons or maybe a hungry bear. Looking at the damage again, though, the tears and the heavy plastic were too clean, too purposeful. Whatever was getting into my trash wasn't just looking for food. It was methodically going through everything, like it was trying to learn about me. Food packaging, mail, personal items. Everything had been examined and either taken or discarded with what seemed like deliberate intent. The smell around my property had changed too, something I'd noticed but not really processed. There was a musky, animal odor that seemed to come and go with no pattern I could identify. It wasn't like any wildlife smell I knew, not bear, not deer, not even the skunks that occasionally wandered through. This was something heavier, more primitive, like being downwind from a zoo on a hot day. The second thermal image, captured 2 days later, made my blood run cold. The creature was standing upright now, and the scale of it hit me like a punch to the gut. 8 feet tall had been a conservative estimate. This thing was closer to 9 feet, maybe more, with a build that spoke of raw, untamed power. It was walking upright like a person, but the gait was all wrong, too fluid, too confident in the darkness of the forest. What really got to me was that it seemed to be following a pattern. The timestamp showed it moving along what looked like a patrol route, staying just inside the tree line but clearly focused on my house. It wasn't random wandering. This was deliberate surveillance. The way it moved showed familiarity with the terrain, like it had been making this circuit for weeks or maybe months before I'd started paying attention. I started finding footprints after that. Massive impressions in the mud near my creek that were easily twice the size of my boot. The depth of them suggested something incredibly heavy, and the spacing between steps was longer than any human stride. There were claw marks on some of the older trees, gouged deep into the bark about 8 or 9 feet off the ground. Fresh marks, not old bare scratches. The wood was still white where it had been torn, sap still bleeding from the wounds. My 2 dogs, a German Shepherd mix and a Border Collie who'd never been afraid of anything in their lives, started acting strange. They'd been fine during the day, but once the sun went down, they'd whimper and hide under the furniture. They refused to go outside for their evening walk, something that had never happened before. When I tried to force the issue, they'd plant their feet and refuse to move, shaking with terror. Animals know things we don't, and mine were telling me something dangerous was out there. The changes in their behavior were dramatic and consistent. During the day, they'd patrol the house nervously, hackles raised, constantly looking out the windows toward the tree line. They'd position themselves between me and any door or window that faced the forest, like they were trying to protect me from something they could sense, but I couldn't. Their appetite dropped off, and they started sleeping pressed against my bedroom door instead of in their usual spots. The third thermal image confirmed my worst fears. The creature was standing at full height now, and I could see just how massive it really was. The heat signature suggested a body mass that had to be close to 500 pounds, maybe more. But what made me consider packing up and leaving immediately was what it was carrying. In its hands, and they were clearly hands, not paws, it held what looked like rocks or large branches. It wasn't just wandering through my woods anymore, it was arming itself. The intelligence this implied was terrifying. This wasn't some dumb animal acting on instinct. This was a thinking creature that understood tools, that could plan ahead, that was preparing for some kind of confrontation. The thermal showed it examining the rocks or branches in its hands, testing their weight, their balance. It was selecting weapons the way a human might choose a hammer from a toolbox. The howling started that same night. I'd heard coyotes before, plenty of times. I'd heard wolves during a trip to Alaska and mountain lions during mating season. This was nothing like any of those sounds. It was deeper, more resonant, and there was something almost human about the way it modulated and changed pitch. But no human throat could produce something that loud or that terrifying. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the mountains and trees until I couldn't tell where it was originating. My nearest neighbor was 3 miles away, and cell service was spotty at best up here. I'd chosen this place specifically for the isolation and privacy, but now that seclusion felt like a trap waiting to spring shut. The gravel road leading to my property was a half-mile long and only wide enough for one vehicle. If something happened to my truck, or if something was waiting on that road, I'd be completely cut off from help. I started keeping my hunting rifle loaded and within reach at all times. I'd grown up around guns, been hunting since I was 12, but I'd never had to think about using a weapon for protection against something like this. A .30-06 would drop a bear or an elk without question, but looking at the mass and muscle definition in those thermal images, I wasn't sure it would be enough to stop whatever I was dealing with. The fourth image showed the creature moving with obvious intent, heading directly toward my house rather than following its usual perimeter route. The thermal reading showed the heat signature of something that was worked up, excited, or agitated. Its movement had changed too, less careful, more aggressive. It was no longer content to just observe from the shadows. Something had changed in its behavior, and I was pretty sure that something was my cameras. It knew it was being watched, and it didn't like it. I could make out more details in this shot. The muscle definition was incredible, like nothing I'd ever seen outside of anatomy textbooks. But this wasn't human anatomy. The proportions were wrong, the limb length skewed towards something that had adapted for life in dense forest. Its gait showed a predatory confidence that made every primitive alarm bell in my brain start screaming. This was an apex predator in its natural environment, and I was the intruder. The howling became a nightly occurrence after that. Sometimes it sounded like it was coming from different directions, like there might be more than one of them out there. Other times it seemed like the same creature calling from various points around my property, maybe trying to confuse me about its location. Either way, the message was clear. I was being hunted. The calls had a pattern to them, almost like a language, and I got the unsettling feeling that information was being communicated, plans being made. I started hearing rocks hitting the side of my house at night. Small ones at first, like someone was testing to see if I'd react. When I didn't come outside to investigate, I wasn't that stupid. They got bigger. Eventually, I was hearing what sounded like baseball-sized stones striking my walls and windows, hard enough to crack the glass, but not quite hard enough to break through. Each impact was precisely placed, never random, always targeting specific areas like it was mapping out weak points. It was testing my defenses, learning the layout of my house, figuring out my weaknesses. The intelligence behind the attacks was what scared me most. This wasn't some dumb animal acting on instinct. This thing was planning, analyzing, preparing for something bigger. The pattern of impacts suggested it understood structural engineering better than most humans. It was targeting load-bearing walls, window frames, door jambs. I started documenting everything: the times of the attacks, the locations of impact, the patterns in the howling. Looking at my notes, I could see a definite escalation in both frequency and intensity. What had started as occasional harassment was becoming a nightly siege. The creature was losing patience with whatever game it was playing. The final thermal image I captured was the most terrifying of all. The creature was right at the edge of my property, maybe 50 yards from my back door. For the first time, I could make out details of its face in the heat signature. The skull was massive, elongated, with what looked like a pronounced brow ridge. The heat patterns showed blood vessels and muscle tension that spoke of an emotional state I didn't want to think about too hard. This wasn't curiosity or territorial posturing anymore. This was anger. What really made my hands shake was the realization that it was looking directly at the camera. It knew I was watching, it knew I had evidence of its existence, and judging by its body language, it wasn't happy about it. The way it stood, the positioning of its arms, even the tilt of its head, everything about its posture radiated menace and intelligence. It was studying the camera the same way it had been studying my house, learning how I was watching it so it could counter my surveillance. That night, it didn't bother with the usual patrol route. It came straight to my house and started what I can only describe as a siege. The rock throwing escalated to boulder-sized stones that actually did crack my windows. I could hear it moving around the building, testing different entry points. It rattled my doors, pushed against my windows, and at one point I heard what sounded like it trying to climb onto my roof. The sounds from above were terrifying. Heavy footsteps, scratching, something being dragged across the shingles. I'd barricaded myself in my bedroom with my hunting rifle, but I wasn't sure a .3006 would even slow something that size down. The sounds it was making weren't entirely animal. There were grunts and what almost sounded like words, but in no language I'd ever heard. The intelligence behind those sounds was more frightening than any roar or howl would have been. It was trying to communicate, to intimidate, to break down my resistance through psychological warfare. The attack lasted for hours. I tracked its movement by sound as it circled my house over and over, each circuit bringing it a little closer, making it a little bolder. It found the weak spots in my defenses, the basement window I'd been meaning to replace, the back door that didn't quite sit right in its frame, the section of roof where I'd had repair work done last year. Every structural weakness in my house was being cataloged and tested. Around 3 a.m, the sound stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the assault had been. I knew it was still out there, but now it was being quiet on purpose. It had learned that noise brought no response, so it was changing tactics. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, broken only by the occasional creak of the house settling or the whisper of wind in the trees. But underneath that normal nighttime quiet, I could sense something waiting, something watching. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my bedroom with my back to the wall, rifle across my knees, listening to every creak and groan of my house settling. Every normal nighttime sound seemed amplified and threatening. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted and shaking. But I was alive. The morning light revealed new damage to my property. Gouges in the siding where it had tested the walls, broken branches where it had climbed, massive footprints in the mud around my house. The attacks continued for the next week, each night bringing new terror. It began to learn my routine, my habits, my weaknesses. It knew when I went to bed, when I woke up, when I was most vulnerable. The howling would start just as I was drifting off to sleep, jolting me awake. The rock throwing would begin whenever I tried to relax. It was psychological warfare, and it was working. I was barely sleeping, jumping at every shadow, afraid to leave my house even during daylight hours. The creature had effectively made me a prisoner in my own home. I couldn't check my mail without scanning the tree line first. I couldn't work in my garden or maintenance my property. Even simple tasks like taking out the garbage became exercises in terror. I'd sprint from the house to the trash cans and back, never turning my back on the forest, never staying outside longer than absolutely necessary. Then it escalated beyond harassment. One morning, I woke up to find my truck's tires slashed, long tears that could only have been made by claws. The cuts were surgical in their precision, not random slashing, but deliberate punctures designed to make the tires unusable but not immediately obvious. If I hadn't done a walk-around inspection before trying to drive to town, I would have had a blowout on the mountain road miles from help. The next night, my power lines were cut, not broken by wind or weather, but deliberately severed. The cuts were clean, made with something sharp, and positioned in a way that would be almost impossible for a human to reach without a ladder. It was systematically removing my ability to escape or call for help. First mobility, then communications, then what? My water supply, my food storage. My generator ran out of fuel after 3 days, and I wasn't about to venture outside to refill it. The darkness was its domain, and I wasn't going to give it any more advantages. I rationed my flashlight batteries and tried to stay quiet, hoping it would lose interest and move on. But every night brought new evidence that it hadn't lost interest at all. The attacks were becoming more focused, more personal. It didn't just want me gone, it wanted me helpless first. The attacks became more coordinated, more intelligent. It would make noise at the front of the house to draw my attention, then test windows and doors at the back. It learned to mimic sounds. I swear I heard my neighbor's dog barking one night, coming from the direction of my backyard, but my neighbor lived 3 miles away and his dog had been dead for 2 months. The mimicry was perfect, from the pitch to the rhythm to the specific bark pattern that dog had always used when it wanted attention. Food became an issue when it destroyed my solar panels and my refrigerator finally gave up. I was down to canned goods and whatever I could eat without cooking. The smell of cooked food seemed to drive it into a frenzy, so I gave up hot meals entirely. Even opening a can of soup would trigger howling from the forest, followed by increasingly aggressive harassment. It could smell everything, could detect the slightest change in my routine or behavior. It was learning, adapting, getting smarter about its attacks. What started as simple harassment had become a methodical campaign to drive me out of my home, or maybe just to drive me insane before it finally decided to finish me off. The psychological pressure was becoming unbearable. I found myself talking to my dogs just to hear a voice, even my own. I started having conversations with the creature, shouting challenges and threats at the forest that were met only with that terrible, intelligent silence. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night. I'd been dozing fitfully in my recliner when I heard the sound of breaking glass from my kitchen. Not the impact of a thrown rock, but the deliberate shattering of a window being broken inward. The sound was followed by careful movement, the soft thud of something large and heavy landing on my kitchen floor. It was coming inside. I grabbed my rifle and tried to control my breathing as I listened to it moving through my kitchen. Heavy footsteps, careful and deliberate. Cabinet doors opening and closing. The refrigerator door being pulled open, even though it hadn't been running for days. It was foraging, but also exploring, learning about the inside of my house the same way it had mapped the outside. The footsteps moved into my living room. I could hear it examining my furniture, my belongings. A bookshelf was knocked over, not in anger, but seemingly out of curiosity about what was behind it. Books scattered across the floor, their pages rustling as it examined them. It was studying my life, trying to understand me the way a scientist might study a lab rat. I held my breath as the footsteps approached my bedroom door. The handle turned slowly, but I'd barricaded it with my dresser. The door pushed against the obstruction, testing its strength. The pressure was immense. I could hear the wood of the doorframe creaking under the strain. But instead of forcing its way in, the footsteps moved away toward the bathroom, the spare room, methodically mapping out every corner of my house. It stayed inside for over an hour. When it finally left, I heard the sound of my back door being carefully opened and closed. It hadn't broken out. It had learned to use the door handle. The implications of that simple action were staggering. This wasn't just brute force and primitive intelligence. This was a creature capable of understanding and manipulating human technology. The next morning, I found massive, muddy footprints throughout my house, but more disturbing than the evidence of intrusion was what it had done while inside. Food was missing from my cabinets, but not randomly. It had taken specific items, canned meat, energy bars, things with high protein content. It knew what it was looking for, could read labels, or at least understand packaging well enough to distinguish between different types of food. My photo albums had been pulled out and scattered across the floor, pictures examined and discarded. Family photos, vacation snapshots, pictures of friends, all handled with what looked like careful attention. It had gone through my mail, my personal papers, even my computer files, if the moved papers near my desk were any indication. My laptop had been moved, the screen raised and lowered like it was trying to understand what it was looking at. It hadn't just been foraging, it had been researching me, learning about my life, my relationships, my history. The thoroughness of the search was chilling. This creature understood that information was power, that knowing your enemy was the first step to defeating them. That's when I knew I had to leave. This wasn't a territorial dispute or a case of mistaken identity. This creature saw me as competition, maybe even as a threat to be eliminated. The intelligence behind its actions was undeniable, and that intelligence was focused entirely on me. It had studied me like a specimen, cataloged my weaknesses, and was now ready to move to the next phase of whatever plan it had developed. I waited until noon the next day when the sun was high and the forest was quiet. Whatever this thing was, it seemed to prefer the darkness, so daylight was my best chance. I grabbed my truck keys, a backpack with a few essentials, and my rifle. Everything else, my furniture, my books, my life's accumulation of possessions, would have to stay behind. The truck started on the first try, which felt like a miracle. I'd been afraid it might have sabotaged the engine along with the tires. The replacement tires I'd put on were holding air. and I had enough fuel to reach town if I drove carefully. My hands shook as I put the truck in reverse, but I was committed now. There was no going back. As I backed out of my driveway, I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Looking up at my bedroom window, I saw a massive, dark shape standing just inside the glass, watching me leave. Even through the thermal reflection of the window, I could see enough to confirm every terrifying detail the cameras had captured. The size, the proportions, the intelligence in its posture. Everything was exactly as the thermal images had shown. It let me go. Maybe it had gotten what it wanted. My territory, my house, my belongings. Maybe it was satisfied with having driven me away. Or maybe it was just confident that I posed no real threat to whatever larger purpose it served. The fact that it didn't try to stop me was almost more unsettling than if it had attacked. It suggested a level of calculation and restraint that implied even greater intelligence than I'd credited it with. I drove for 6 hours straight, not stopping until I reached a city large enough to have traffic lights and chain restaurants. I checked into a motel and slept for 14 hours, the first real sleep I'd had in weeks. When I woke up, I felt like I'd escaped from a nightmare, but I knew it hadn't been a dream. The thermal images on my laptop were proof enough of that. That was 4 months ago. I never went back to collect my belongings. The property is still in my name, but I'll never set foot on it again. I told my insurance company that I'd had a break-in and couldn't return due to safety concerns, which was technically true. They covered the bare minimum, enough to start over somewhere else, but I lost most of my life savings in the process. I moved to a small city in the Midwest, far from any deep forests. I rent a second-floor apartment in a building with good lighting and plenty of neighbors. I sleep better now, but I still wake up sometimes convinced I can hear that howling in the distance. I keep my windows locked even on hot nights, and I've installed motion sensor lights that cover every approach to my building. The thermal cameras are long gone, abandoned with everything else. I'd downloaded the images to my laptop before I left, but I've never shown them to anyone. What would be the point? People would think they were fake, or that I was crazy, or both. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to convince anyone that these things are real. The fewer people who go looking for them, the better. But sometimes I see news reports that make me wonder. Hikers gone missing in the national forests, unexplained property damage in rural areas, cattle mutilations that don't fit the usual patterns. I watch these stories and wonder if other people are dealing with what I dealt with, but without thermal cameras to show them what they're really up against. There was a story last month about a family that abandoned their cabin in Colorado, leaving behind all their possessions and refusing to explain why. The local sheriff said they seemed terrified but wouldn't file a report or describe what had frightened them. The property has been on the market ever since, but no one will buy it. The realtor says prospective buyers get an uneasy feeling when they visit the site, like they're being watched from the woods. Another report from Washington State described a series of break-ins at remote cabins, but nothing valuable was ever stolen. Instead, the intruder seemed to go through personal belongings, examine photos and documents, then leave everything scattered around like they were conducting some kind of research. The police blamed teenagers or vandals, but teenagers don't leave footprints the size of dinner plates in the mud outside broken windows. The worst part is the doubt that creeps in during quiet moments. Did I really experience what I think I experienced? Are those thermal images real, or did stress and isolation play tricks on my mind? But then I remember the intelligence I saw in those recordings, the calculated nature of the harassment, the fact that it learned to open doors. No hallucination could be that consistent, that detailed, that terrifyingly logical. I've started checking thermal imaging websites and apps, not because I'm looking for trouble, but because I want to be prepared if it finds me again. I don't know if what I encountered was territorial or if it might have followed me. I don't know if there are more of them or if they communicate with each other across distances. The thought that there might be a network of these creatures sharing information about human settlements and individuals who've had contact with them keeps me awake some nights. What I do know is that there are things in the deep forests that we don't understand, things with intelligence and purpose that far exceed what we give them credit for. They're not just animals acting on instinct, and they're not the gentle giants that cryptid enthusiasts like to imagine. They're calculating predators with the intelligence to plan and adapt, and they see us as competitors for resources and territory. I keep a thermal monocular in my car now, just in case. I check it whenever I'm in rural areas, whenever I'm somewhere that cell service gets spotty, whenever the trees get thick enough to hide something large. So far, I haven't seen anything that doesn't belong, but I'm not taking any chances. The thermal signature of that creature is burned into my memory. The distinctive heat pattern, the massive size, the way it moved with predatory confidence through its environment. The thing that haunts me most isn't the fear or the property I lost. It's the certainty that I was being studied the whole time, analyzed and cataloged like a specimen. Whatever that creature was, it learned everything it needed to know about me, my habits, my weaknesses, my limitations. It mapped my entire life in the span of a few weeks, and then it let me go. I don't think I escaped. I think I was dismissed as irrelevant. That might be the most terrifying realization of all. We like to think we're apex predators, that we're the dominant intelligence on this planet. But what if we're not? What if there are things in the wilderness that tolerate our presence only as long as we stay in our designated areas and deal with us decisively when we venture too far into their territory? The thermal images sit on my laptop, filed away in a folder I rarely open. They're proof of something that shouldn't exist, evidence of an encounter that most people would refuse to believe. But they're also a reminder of how quickly our comfortable assumptions about the world can be shattered by reality. We think we know what's out there in the wilderness, but we're wrong. We've barely scratched the surface of what exists in the deep forests, the places where human footsteps rarely fall and our technology can't penetrate. I don't go camping anymore. I don't take hiking trips or visit remote areas. I stay in populated places where streetlights push back the darkness and where help is always just a phone call away. It might be cowardice, but it's practical cowardice. I know what's out there now, and I know I'm not equipped to deal with it. None of us are. Sometimes I wonder about the people who do venture into those deep forests, the ones who don't come back. The official reports usually blame exposure, getting lost, falling into ravines or rivers. But I wonder how many of them encountered what I encountered, except without the luxury of thermal cameras to warn them what they were dealing with. How many of those missing hikers stumbled into territory that was already claimed, already being defended by something that saw them as intruders to be eliminated? The searches always focus on natural causes, human error, equipment failure. They never look for evidence of predation by something that doesn't officially exist. They never consider that some of those missing hikers might have stumbled into territory that was already claimed by something bigger, stronger, and smarter than they were prepared for. I check the news sometimes for stories from the area where my property is located. There haven't been any reports of missing persons, but there also haven't been any reports of new residents moving into the area. Property values in that region have supposedly dropped, though the real estate listings never mention why. They just describe the land as rustic and perfect for those seeking privacy and solitude. If anyone else moves into my old house, I hope they're smarter than I was. I hope they install security systems, keep weapons handy, and pay attention to what their animals are trying to tell them. I hope they don't make the mistake of thinking they're dealing with an ordinary predator or a simple territorial dispute. But mostly, I hope they just stay away altogether. Some territories aren't meant for humans, no matter how well armed or prepared we think we are. Some places belong to things that were there long before us, and that will be there long after we're gone. The thermal cameras captured something that probably should have stayed hidden. Now that I know it's out there, I can't unknow it. I can't pretend that the wilderness is the peaceful, empty space we like to imagine it is. There are watchers in the deep forests, ancient intelligences that study us as carefully as we study them. The only difference is that they're better at it than we are, and they're still out there, waiting in the darkness beyond our thermal cameras, beyond our understanding, beyond our ability to control or predict. All we can do is hope they continue to see us as irrelevant rather than as threats worth eliminating. Because if they ever change their minds about that, our thermal cameras won't save us. Nothing will. For more interesting stories like this one, check this out.